Hi, Karl Sakas here, agency consultant at Sakas & Company, and welcome to Agency Office Hours for November 2021. Yes, this is Agency Office Hours where I answer your questions about growing your agency more profitably this year and beyond. I'll be answering several questions today that I've received in advance that I'll be answering live. Here is the plan. Here's what is coming up. Mare in Switzerland has a question about getting access to the client C-suite. Meg in Boston has a question about up-leveling as an agency leader. I'll be answering a question about helping you create a growth plan for the coming year. Brady in Florida has a question about pricing for profitability. And finally, Mark in Rhode Island has a question about scaling the agency. If you're on the list, please be ready to unmute yourself in that order. If you have a question you'd like to ask me in a future agency office hours, include that when you RSVP. If you're listening live, Kate is sharing the link to that in chat, or if you're watching the video, there's a link to it in the video description. As a reminder, we are recording agency office hours today, so if you share something, please don't share anything you don't want to potentially become public later. All right. Well, first up is Mare in Switzerland. Mare, if you want to unmute and let's see how things go. Go ahead if you want to unmute yourself. All right.
Hello.
Mare, hello, and good evening. Thank you for joining.
Hi, Karl. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I'm actually driving on my way to a client meeting. But this was too important to me, so I'll just do something that I probably shouldn't do. But nevertheless, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, so to paraphrase, what we might do, if you want to ask your question, and then if you want to just go into listen mode, I can just answer the question from there to help focus that way. Does that work?
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So I'll put it as succinctly as I can.
Yes.
We have know how to influence strategy of our clients, but we do not always get to talk to the C-suite. So we get to talk to a marketing manager who does not call the shots, so to speak. So it's also much more difficult to get anything strategic across because he runs into objections upstairs and we cannot influence people that we are not in contact with. So my question is, how can we, get clients C-suite to talk to us instead of just like a vendor, having the access only to the marketing department?
That makes sense. Well, let me answer your question, and you can go off mic at this point, and I'll answer in general. So to paraphrase, how does your agency get access to the client C-suite, get access to the major decision makers rather than the people who are perhaps lower in the organization? Well, this starts from the beginning. It starts in the sales process. Now, depending on the size of clients you're working with, you may not always get access to the C-suite. For instance, a client works with a very large bank, and they're working with the person who's like the layer below the CMO, and there's sort of another layer there. So they're relatively senior within the organization. They're not the CMO, but that's okay, depending on the nature of your work. If you're doing an overall rebrand for the client, the CMO and the CEO need to be involved in that. On the other hand, if you're doing, pay-per-click ads for a multinational organization, you're probably not going to be talking to the CMO. But consider it starts with the sort of the boundaries you set in the sales process. That is, who are you requiring to be involved in the sales conversations? Who has to fill out your pre-questionnaire? In my work with independent agencies, I require that all owners of the agency, 1 to 3 owners, complete the pre-questionnaire to share about their goals. And there are occasionally situations where someone maybe, say, a minority owner who is not really involved in the business, but in general, everyone has to complete it. Because I found that if people aren't involved in the sales process, even if they aren't going to be involved later, they're likely to show up and create some challenges later. The technical term for that is swoop and poop, right? They fly in, leave some negative feedback, and fly away, leaving you to clean up the mess. So that starts in the sales process, and the tone you set then extends to there being a client. That is, who are the people you need to work with? So part of the sales process can include saying the different roles that need to be involved in the meetings, ongoing meetings, at least major milestone meetings, say kickoff, for instance, quarterly meetings, things like that, maybe major milestones, because you don't want surprises later. For instance, I once worked with a nonprofit. It was an endowment. We were creating a new website for them. And we were working with the communications director. We occasionally spoke with the executive director. So the senior most person and the senior marketing type person, day to day, but they also had a board of directors. And my suspicion as the account manager and project manager was that the board would want to get involved in some capacity. So we created some updates to help the communications director and the executive director share with the board so they were in the loop. In the end, that worked out smoothly. I had another client where, another nonprofit, the communications director was like, no, we don't need to tell the board about it. And then things blew up later where, as we were building the website, all of the board members wanted to be listed on the website, and they didn't like how they were listed, even though that was not in the scope, to create some sort of fully blown out, team member featured person kind of thing. So, a lot of it is the stage you set at the beginning to say, we are a strategic agency. We're a strategy first agency. People at these levels need to be involved. Again, keeping in mind, if you're working with an enormous corporation, you may not be working with the CMO and the CEO. On the other hand, worked with a client that had a squirrely sales prospect. The end client of the agency or prospect had about 20 to 25 people, and he'd been talking with the marketing team, and they kept saying, the CEO, they're too busy, this and that. And finally, he sent an ultimatum. I gave him some guidance on what to put, and basically, he's like, I'm glad to help, but at this point, if we can't get the CEO involved, then agency has to withdraw. And you know what? It worked. The client said, okay, we're going to get the CEO. The agency owner talked to the CEO in the owner's sales hat, and they were able to get things sorted out. And it looks like there is some potential. And importantly, it's after the agency has set some boundaries with the client. So I'm curious if you're listening live, feel free to share in chat. What are some things you do at your agency to connect with the client C-level or the client decision makers? While people are sharing, I also want to mention something where, what if you have a situation where a client contact claims to be a decision maker, but they really aren't, right? They say they're in charge, but they're not really. Now, you, of course, whether this is a sales communication or an ongoing account management communication, you want to talk to the real decision maker, at least when it comes time for decisions. And so in that case, there's a question you can ask that will help you surface what's really going on without making someone feel bad about, no, they're not really in charge. Because if you ask people, are you in charge? They would say yes, because they want to feel special and all that. If you've seen the movie Glengarry Glen Ross, there's a case where, yes, there's always about to always be closing, which is funny, but don't do that as your sales process. But there's also a bit where they've closed a prospect and the salesperson is really excited, but it turns out the prospect has no money. They just like talking to salespeople. Not good. So how can you surface that without making people having to admit that they're not as important as they are? You can ask this, some version of this. Let's say we're at the point where you decide things sound promising, you're ready to go. What are your next steps from there? If they say something like, I'll send it to legal, I'll send it to the accounting department, we'll get that sorted out, I'll tell them to hurry it up, and and then we'll get you the payment, get you the signature, and so on, they probably are the decision maker. On the other hand, if they say something along the lines of, well, great, that all sounds good. then I'm going to send that to my boss for their review. And then if they're on board with it, I don't know, maybe I'll talk with them. We might need maybe another presentation, okay. And then after that, I don't know what they do. Okay, that's a sign that the person you're talking to is not the final decision maker. And you have an opportunity to enlist them as a sponsor, as a supporter, but be careful about investing too much time assuming that they are in charge. Well, Mari, I know you need to run. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you, by the way, for shares in chat. Meg, who will be right up next, in fact, for Q&A, mentioning get clients involved as subject matter experts, especially technical companies, for instance, interviewing them for a blog post. Great way to build the relationship for sure when you're creating content. It makes them feel special. They are the expert and you are positioning them as the expert. And, maybe you find that someone who doesn't have time for everything, but, suddenly they have time for you to make them the hero. Definitely a win-win, along with, as you mentioned, the quarterly and milestone meetings. Awesome. Well, next up in Q&A is Meg in Boston. If you want to come off mute, welcome to Agency Office Hours.
Thank you so much.
Well, the question that you'd shared, I'll paraphrase this a little bit. Your situation is similar to many agency leaders where you had originally been a freelancer and you are now running an agency and things are different. So if you could share a bit more about your question, and then I can help share some advice.
Yeah, definitely. So I went from largely being a freelancer. I often had sort of a partner that I would work with, but we were essentially separate 1099s on paper. And over the last year, the industry that we serve has been exploding. And so I made the decision to start consciously building an agency. So as of now, I have 10 employees. I had 0 this time last year. So it's been a big year of growth, which is exciting. And I've just joined your boot camp, so I'm looking forward to that as well. But yeah, my question is essentially, I worked at an agency prior to going out and freelancing. And I sort of ran the content team, but I didn't really have any direct reports. So I have never been formally trained as a manager or leader. I think in some ways it's something that comes naturally to me, or there's certain aspects of it that come naturally to me. But in other ways, I'm learning to building the plane while you fly it. That's the term. So yeah, just looking for some advice on how to grow into leadership.
Well, just the fact already that you have hired people to help rather than trying to keep doing it all yourself puts you ahead of many people. I worked with an agency owner several years ago in Australia who had a couple months earlier closed a $20,000 a month retainer, and his plan was to fulfill all of that work himself on top of his existing role. And yeah, with inflation, that might be say 25,000. Yeah, when he reached out, it was not working. He was not getting it done. So the fact that you've already hired team members is helpful. One of the things to consider, and we'll share a link in chat about this, about changing your team structure as you grow. At 10 people, you're generally on the cusp of bringing in an account manager or project manager or someone to help handle some of that coordination, both client facing on the AM and internally facing on the PM. Those roles also can help you grow more if you choose by coordinating contractors to help get things done as well. But going from 0 to 10, you said in a year, that is very fast. So if it feels like, whoa, this is really fast, it sure is. So some of that is just enlisting help in general. The other thing to consider would be, what are the roles? If we think of the 6 agency roles, you've got account management, keep the clients happy, project management, get the work done smoothly and profitably, your subject matter experts, your SMEs, that's about getting their highly billable work done all day, although AM and PM are still billable. You've got, focus on strategists, you're giving advice to clients to maximize the ROI of their budget, plus biz dev and support, the non-billable roles. So, with that in mind, as you keep growing, usually what people will do is they will outsource the SME work first. You mentioned you have focus on content. Increasingly, you will be writing sort of increasingly less and less of the content yourself, writing or design or video or what have you, less and less of that yourself. Now, you are likely to continue doing some things, probably client strategy, the strategist role, to some degree, client relationships, account management. But usually I'll see people outsource subject matter expert work, then outsource project management, eventually day-to-day account management, and usually the last thing to go is the strategist role. What transition are you seeing so far, Meg?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of an interesting situation because I just took a 3-month maternity leave.
Welcome back, and congratulations,
Thank
and
you.
welcome back.
So there is a little bit of me kind of coming in and trying to assess where certain clients are who are used to seeing me on a day-to-day basis, and
Yes.
getting that getting a lot of strategy directly from me. So I would say there are some teams where I'm needing to do a bit of the subject matter expert work. Project management and account management, actually, I've got some team members who are really, really great with that.
Yeah.
It's mostly I'm probably the one on the team who has the most depth as far as we work with pretty technical companies, a lot of cybersecurity and DevSecOps and things like that. So there's some challenges around just kind of getting my team kind of up leveled in terms of understanding the subject matter, and helping build confidence with my clients in my team.
That makes sense. And Kate, if you could share our article on agencies with junior team members and navigating that with clients, that'd be helpful. Some of that, Meg, is transmitting through your authority that this new team member is good, they are competent, they will take good care of you. Of course, you need to feel confident that they will do that as well, right? If you just hand things over to them and it doesn't go well, that hurts your credibility. And of course, it's a challenge. Whenever people hire junior team members, my general guidance is, great, you'll save on compensation, but in exchange, you might be spending 10 hours a week training and coaching them. Which raises, do you have someone on the team who is maybe mid or senior who could help handle some of those questions so they don't all go to you?
To an extent, yeah. We have some great team members who are able to coach, and I think we've built a really strong culture around coaching up employees. And actually, I would say we're probably a little more weighted on senior team members versus junior team members.
Okay.
We kind of have a bottleneck around that training. But yeah, I think it's we're trying a few things. We brought in an expert to give a talk to the whole agency about security, a security marketing expert. I'm trying to find some more time in my day to just kind of transmit that knowledge.
Yeah. That part about finding time in your day, thinking in the past when you were wearing your freelancer hat, you're doing all the work, you're doing the client relationships, you're coordinating the work, you're selling the work, and if you had any time left in your day, we're doing marketing to build your pipeline to find more work. A couple of things that people often struggle with as they're at this phase in their transition and growth is one, shoemakers kids, making time for your own marketing. A while back, had interviewed Joe Polizzi, then of the Content Marketing Institute, and he noted, when people ask him for agency recommendations, one of the things is, how are they doing on their own thing? If they're a content agency, how's their content? If they're a social media agency, how's their social media? If they're a video-oriented agency, how's their, and same, search marketing and so on. Now, the reality is, in my work with hundreds of agencies and observing hundreds and thousands more, just because an agency isn't doing a great job with its own marketing doesn't mean it's not good at it for clients. They tend to put most of their efforts toward clients. The problem is, eventually your pipeline will run dry, and create a feast or famine situation. So, there are a few ways to dedicate time to make that happen. One, I'm a fan of, if you've read the Tina Fey autobiography, Bossy Pants, she talks about how Lorne Michaels, the creator of Saturday Night Live, has a phrase. This is where, he's got a team of, dozens or maybe hundreds altogether of creative people, and people may be a little perfectionistic about getting it done. But, apparently his phrase is, the show doesn't go on because you're ready. The show goes on because it's 11:30. Like, it is time for the show, ready or not, it's starting. And so, one way to look at that is, my email newsletters. They must go out every Wednesday, generally with new content, every Saturday, based on my testing about the, what's the best second day to send it. Saturday, typically with classic content. And there are a couple other sends that go out as well. But basically, it's like that must happen. The email must go out on Wednesday, must go out on Saturday. And so in, 8.5, approaching 9 years in business, the only time it didn't go out, one, there was some sort of a technical malfunction while I was traveling and just missed it. And the other time I was in the hospital for emergency surgery. But you know what? I should have planned ahead and should have had all of that scheduled in advance. So, shame on me. So, by making it an appointment kind of thing, it helps create structure to get it done. Make sure, of course, you have, have a sustainable commitment, right, to get things done. I have a second point, but what's your reaction, Meg, about creating and dedicating time to do self-marketing?
Yeah, that is like the lowest thing on my list all the time. And it's frustrating.
Yeah. Thinking about this, certainly, well, okay, do you want to do the self-marketing, or do you have someone on the team who could take the lead? Maybe not 100% of their time at your current headcount, but maybe 10 hours.
Yeah.
Like,
we had a contractor who was doing that, who actually left during my maternity leave to take a full-time role. So
okay.
That's part of what's going on for sure.
I have noticed also when it comes to family leave, or in particular maternity leave and paternity leave, that usually creates something of a, what do I really want from my business, kind of reality check. And I've had several clients who used their family leave as the impetus for eliminating account management. So they were able to say to their clients, I'm going to be out for a few months, or I'm going to be out for however long. We are transitioning day-to-day account management to so-and-so. You've met them before as the backup person, and you like each other and all that. They will now be the primary, and then the owner doesn't come back to deal with the client afterwards. So that's something to consider. It might be a little too late this round, but
I think we've actually had good success doing that with most of our clients. There's just kind of a few where I've sort of needed to step back in. And some of that has to do with employee turnover, and
that's the thing. Whenever someone leaves, like, it is the boss's job to step in and get things done. So some of that's inevitable. One other point before we switch into the next question is making time to plan for your future. No one else is going to remind you about planning for 5 years from now. Everyone, on the other hand, will be glad to, interrupt you to say they need an answer about something. They need to sign off about something. A client needs something. Someone else needs something. No one is, making that appointment with you to plan for your future. Now, as you mentioned, you've applied for and been accepted to the Work Less, Earn More Bootcamp on agency growth. We actually have some structure built into that. Everyone in the bootcamp will create an advanced retrospective of where they want to be in 5 years as the initial homework heading into week 1. And you'll also create a 90-day plan about how to accelerate your growth while working less and earning more starting in the new year. So good news, you've got an appointment with yourself to do that. For anyone listening, you can create an advanced retrospective, a vision for your ideal future anytime. I've written one for myself in different forms since 2010. I've done 1 year out, 3 years, 5 years. I've even written one as of being hypothetically 90 years old and sort of looking back kind of thing. Don't write that as your first advanced retrospective. That's like too far in the future. But you can at least think, say, a year out, 3 years out, maybe 5 years out, where do you want to be? Because importantly, once you know where you want to go, you can work backwards and enlist your team's help to get there more smoothly. So Meg, thank you so much for sharing your question today, and look forward to seeing you in the Work Less, Earn More Bootcamp.
Thank you.
Speaking of that, coming up, we'll take a look at pricing for profitability. And our final question today, we'll look at scaling your agency as an alternative to selling your agency. But first, a bonus tip from our sponsor, Sakas & Company. Yep, that's me, Karl Sakas. Today's event is sponsored by Sakas & Company to help you grow your agency more smoothly and profitably this year and beyond. So here's the tip. How do you create a plan for your agency's growth in the coming year? On my website, I have a series of articles about creating an annual revenue plan, and certainly would encourage you to check those out. But core thing is, as you're building the financial side on the assumptions to feed into your revenue plan, consider 3 core factors which impact how much you're going to grow, or sometimes you may choose to keep things level for the year. Those 3 factors are this: net new sales, upsells, and attrition. Let's take a look at each of these as you're thinking through what are the right assumptions for the coming year. So net new sales, those are, well, as you might imagine, brand new revenue into your agency from clients you've never worked with before. Or maybe it's been a while and they've come back after a gap of several years. Net new sales are important because it's hard to grow without bringing in some form of new money. How much? Well, it depends on your overall growth model. If you don't have a dedicated full-time salesperson or one or more, that can be hard to make that a major part of your growth. On the other hand, if you have a full-time sales team, client is in the midst of expanding his overall sales team to approaching 10 people, that is going to help him grow a lot. And of course, getting help on fulfillment as well. So net new is all about those new clients. It helps to have a strong pipeline for inbound, for getting the marketing leads to convert them to sales opportunities. The second category about upsells, that's about growth of existing accounts. That's your current accounts, and consider, charging more. For instance, earlier this week, the client mentioned they have a client who's paying $9,000 a month. They've proposed an alternative to grow the account to $12,000 by adding some new services, or the client can keep things as is for $10,000 a month, an 11% growth. So, either way, the account is growing and ideally growing more by adding some more scope. Now, not every client is going to want to pay more. Some may not need more help, so there's not an upsell for additional services, and or they may not be willing to pay more for the services they have, that is, raising your prices, but a lot will. I recommend thinking of it as a portfolio approach to increasing prices. That is, some clients might pay 20% more, 25%, others might stay about the same, and other people will be somewhere in the middle. So consider that as a factor in growth. That third of the 3, the second bucket about upsells. So you've got net new sales, you've got upsells of existing clients, and the third category to consider is attrition. This is the not as fun one, which is that out of some of your clients, not everyone is going to stick around. Now, ideally, attrition is primarily by the agency's choice, that you've decided they're not a match anymore. And maybe they need to pay a certain amount more or else they're out. But you have other clients who are going to leave for other reasons. For instance, if you focus on a particular technology, maybe the client has internal forces that have them switching to a different platform and you can't support them anymore. Or maybe the client gets acquired and the acquirer is bringing all the marketing over to another agency, or will soon enough. And in other cases, those are things within your control, like the client's just unhappy because you've made some missteps and you haven't been able to turn things around. Consider that, yes, you're going to grow through net new, you're going to grow through upsells, but you're also going to have attrition. So if you want to grow, the net new and the upsells have to grow faster, then the attrition is negatively impacting your revenue, negatively impacting your growth. So keep those factors in mind. If you're interested in getting some support as you grow in the coming year, check out my Work Less, Earn More Bootcamp. You can apply now. Go to sakasandcompany.com/bootcamp. And if you're here live, we've shared some links there. The applications will be closing, so you don't have forever to apply. It's taking people typically less than 10 minutes to complete the application. All right, and if you have any questions on that, feel free to DM me or Kate in chat, or reach out training@sakasandcompany.com via email. Alrighty, well, next up, we have two more questions today. We have Brady in Florida and finally Mark in Rhode Island. Brady, if you want to unmute yourself, we can bring you on board and answer your question. All right, so here we go. Brady, welcome. Thanks for joining.
Hello, thank you.
So to paraphrase, you asked a question about pricing and profitability. To summarize, how do we price work to ensure agency level profitability rather than solely project or client level profitability? If you could elaborate a bit on your question, and then we'll dive into answer.
Sure. So I may be a bit of a unique sort of agency among the folks that you work with, but we do mostly product market fit consulting. So some customers are a year-long contract, some are on sort of programs, some are individual projects that eventually hopefully turn into a more of a retainer. But we also went from, very similarly to your previous question, we went from myself and one contractor 8 months ago to about 11 people today. So
wow.
Quick growth, it's been great. We've been able to sort of handle that increase in growth. The one thing that I've been stumped by is, and when it's myself and a contractor, it was easy to say, okay, there's no fixed cost. I build a margin into whatever we're doing, and that was your profitability, right? Now we've got fixed G&A expenses. I'm sort of stumped on, how do you move from just thinking about it in terms of like project profitability into a world where you need to account for all these other expenses and make sure that the overall business is profitable instead of those individual projects themselves. So that's sort of what I'm hoping to glean, is a bit about like, how do I protect margins when I have to consider G&A expenses, some one-time expenses, software costs, all the sorts of things that happen when you get bigger and you've got 12 different pieces of software and multiple different types of people too, right? You've got employees, you've got contractors, and just how do I sort of think about how to price and take those things into account?
Well, there are a number of things to consider, and first, just the fact that you're thinking about this puts you ahead of a lot of business leaders, where rather than realizing later, our margins have disappeared, what do we do now? You have a chance to be more intentional about it. So, a few things to consider. Right. My general agency benchmark for agency revenue, as that splits out to different things, let's imagine a pie chart, 100%. Ideally, 20 to 30% of that is going to net profit margins. That's your pre-tax net profits. You're also going to spend about 20% on overhead. That would be for, say, software subscriptions that you don't rebill to the clients, office expense, web hosting for your own website, that kind of thing, that are non-labor overhead expenses. And then the remaining portion, 50 to 60%, is going to be for labor. Now, in my model, that assumes fully loaded labor that also includes owner compensation, whether it's going as an expense or not, contractors, and and other team members, the employees. So, for instance, if you're spending 50 to 60% on labor and you've got the 20% for overhead, that leaves the 20 to 30% for net margins. Sometimes when people say my margins are 10%, it's almost always because they're overspending on labor. So I would consider, Brady, as you're looking at your finances, and I realize that things have grown rapidly, so some of it's projecting into next year. What does labor look like? How does that compare to the 50 to 60%? If, for instance, you're spending 80% on labor relative to your margins, relative to your revenue, that's going to wipe out all of your margins. So in that case, there are two key levers. One is raising revenue by raising prices and doing bigger engagements, and also to an extent, cutting expenses. But there are limits to how much you can cut your labor expenses. It's a lot easier to raise the prices with the team you've got, rather than have to say, well, we're paying someone 80, let's have someone doing 40 do that. They're probably not going to do it very effectively, kind of thing. So that's an initial thing to think about. If you've got that pie chart of 100% as your total services revenue, carving off 20 to 30 for net profit margins, 20% for overhead, 50 to 60% for all in on labor, I would compare where you are on that, or where you are now to that pie chart. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
The other thing to consider would be thinking about gross margins versus net margins. So the sort of the simplified, or as people are listening, net margins are what is left over after you've paid all of the business expenses, the overhead, labor, and so on. What money is left over? Of course, you still have to pay taxes on that, but what is it before taxes? You also have gross profits, which would be looking at, say, a particular project or a particular client, just based on the labor and direct costs involved to fulfill that. You're ignoring overhead, both in terms of overhead expenses like paying for office space or traveling for a team retreat for a virtual agency, that kind of thing. And you're also excluding kind of full overhead roles. Like if you've got a full-time salesperson or a full-time internal marketing manager, their expenses are not going into the gross margins, but they sure go into the net margin. So, thinking of how things would flow, your gross margins need to be big enough that after allocating out your other expenses, you've still got money left over as net profit margins. What is the range or target for gross margins? Some of that depends on your model. It depends on how expensive is the labor relative to the work you're doing. For instance, if you're doing, Marketo marketing automation, you charge a lot, but it's also fairly expensive from a labor perspective. So, generally I see clients targeting 40 to 60% gross profit margins. Obviously, if you're targeting 40, your net margins are going to be on the lower side. And if it's 60, your margins are going to be higher. There's not one right answer for it. The key thing is the higher your gross margins, whether by finding less expensive labor or charging more or some combination of both, ultimately the higher your net margins, unless you're, blowing all the money on random things. For instance, the agency where, each of the owners had a company car. Did they need a company car? No. Was it a legal tax deduction? Yeah, I guess their accountant said it was, but it wasn't really strictly necessary. But in any case, what's your reaction to that around thinking gross margin and then flowing down to net margin?
No, I think that squares with what I've been trying to do. I don't know where I came up with 60 as sort of the floor for us. I don't, you know, for better, well, I think it's a good thing for us, but I've sort of targeted this idea that this type of work is often done by product marketers who are very expensive.
Right.
But about 60% of the work is not skilled labor, frankly. So we do a lot of the research, we do a lot of those things with lower cost labor, and then the actual analysis and strategy is done by a different set of people who are the 200, 250K a year type folks. So
Right.
The margin seems good from what I see so far. I'm happy that I'm sort of in line with what you were what you're saying. I mean, I was fortunate enough for people to very early tell me very early on that I was undercharging, so that most of my client base were built in with a really high margin if it's just me, right? 75,
Yes.
80%. So
And you're not alone, by the way, on like, oh, raise the prices. I mean, that happens in most of my work. I have a new client starting where they've been charging 125. Like that was what agencies were charging in 2010, 2011.
Right.
And there's been some inflation since then. So I'm glad you've raised it. And I have a future article coming out about the portfolio approach to raising prices. Don't do what one agency did where they hadn't raised prices in 6 years. That is not a good situation. We've also shared a link in chat here. This is a way to think about it from a project management perspective. Ideally, you're always assigning work out to, we could call it the cheapest competent available person. That is, if you've got two people and they're both competent and they're both available, assign it to the person who's at a lower rate, all things considered. Sometimes you have two people and maybe only one is available. Well, then it's going to the other person. Or maybe you've got two people and only one is competent. Well, it's going to the competent one. But all things considered, ideally you have a stable of freelancers, stable of contractors who could help, and you can mix and match as needed. Occasionally, you may choose to take lower gross margins on a particular thing. So ideally, here's a guideline to consider. If you've got a contractor, ideally at least doubling what you're paying them. So say you're paying them 75 an hour, you're billing at least 150. You're billing them at 250, you could bill them, you could pay them up to 125, that kind of thing. If they're an employee, you're ideally tripling that. So if you're paying them $40 an hour, you're ideally billing them at least 120.
Right.
There are occasionally exceptions. For instance, I worked at an agency that was billing 125. We had a contractor that we needed for a key part about sort of sysadmin and security in a $300,000 project. He was billing us 150 an hour. So obviously we're not going to pay him 150 and bill him at 125. We created a senior rate of 200 an hour. So in that case, the gross margins on his work were quite low relative to the overall targets, but he was only doing about 10 hours of work on a $300,000 project, and he enabled a lot of other things. So it's okay to make intentional choices for lower gross margin. Just be careful not to get in the habit of that on an ongoing basis. Any follow-up questions on that before we move to the final question today?
Yeah, my last question is, going back to the, let's say nuts and bolts, I'm scoping out work,
yes.
Right? How do I think about that 20% out there? Do I just build it into every single one of them? Or how do I sort of make sure that, or are you sort of saying like you go for the gross of this and then you sort of manage the other side of it to make sure that it stays in line with that?
The second one. So figure out your gross margin target. You mentioned focusing on 60%. If that 60% then rolls over to cover your overhead so that you're left with 20 to 30% net left behind, you're in good shape. You probably want to work with whether you're accountant or if you have a fractional CFO or someone else to run the numbers to dig a bit deeper on that. I spoke with a client who was charging $18,000 for a website. We did some analysis and it turned out it was in fact profitable. And I was like, how did you come up with that? And he was like, I just guessed. he had a lucky guess. Like the number he guessed was profitable, but it could have been the other way. So I would say follow up with your accounting person to dig a bit deeper, but you're definitely on the right track.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely, thanks, Brady. Final question for today. We have a question from Mark in Rhode Island. Mark, if you want to unmute yourself and join, welcome to Agency Office Hours.
Thanks, Carl.
So you have a question about scaling, specifically as you're thinking about the future for the agency. You know, a lot of people are thinking, do I sell? Do I scale to grow on my own, or what? Could you share a bit more about your question, and then we can dig in to answer?
Yeah, great. Thanks for the opportunity, and I'm glad to be here. You know, my little agency has been doing great, and we've had a great couple of years, even through the pandemic. So we're really quite blessed with that. And this is our 21st year of through the grind. And through those years, the ultimate goal is always to exit and either grow with a larger entity, agency, or business, or just exit completely. Over the last couple of years, we found that we really wanted to join something bigger and kind of scale as we plateaued a bit, and even through the best effort, and just kind of grow and scale with them. I think my question becomes, through the LOI that we've engaged in, letter of intent, if it's not executed for some reason, I'm wondering, well, what do you do? And there's a lot of reasons it may not be executed, and there's always these variables or hurdles. But if it doesn't go through, I'm kind of like, well, do I find another suitor? Do I just like put my head down to the ground and optimize processes and get to the sales and just crank it out and stay profitable? So I'm just kind of in that middle zone. What if? It'd be great. But if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. The stars weren't aligned for whatever reason. So I'm not sure what's the best next step in that kind of middle gray area as an agency owner.
Well, I think you already know the answer, or a key answer, about where you'd like to go, which is you'd like to do an exit. You know, for some
Correct.
agency owners, they're like, I don't want to sell really, but if someone showed up, one person said, with a dump truck full of cash, they would sell. I mean, I lived in New Jersey for 5 years. I heard about those dump trucks full of cash, but I think there were some strings attached to taking the dump truck full of cash. Or other people are like, you know, absolutely must sell, you know, but I don't want to, you know, work a crazy workload to get there. So it sounds like if we think about the equity versus lifestyle continuum, you lean toward the equity side of building something to grow. And indeed, after 21 years, like that's a lot of time. So you already know where you want to go. You know that the goal is an exit. Two core options to consider. One is to engage a business broker or another M&A, you know, mergers and acquisition specialist, to basically market to the agency, to put it out on the open market. You know, usually there's some sort of a blind ad. You know, they're like, an agency with this many people and this, you know, much info that has been around for 21 years, you know, owner is looking to exit, this and that. And, you know, they'll get inquiries, and of course they'll take a percentage. But, you know, it's kind of like, you know, if you're selling a house, I mean, right now, it's certainly a crazy market. But, you know, generally it's like you could sell it yourself, but it's probably worth hiring someone who can get it into the multiple listing system and deal with a lot of the details, you know, to do that. So that's the idea of the business broker. But what also might make sense, and you could potentially do a bit of both, is grow the numbers, raise earnings. You know, for independent agencies, most are selling for a multiple of earnings, like a 3 to 6 multiple, 3 to 6x multiple of annual earnings, perhaps averaged over the past 3 years. So if based on that, the valuation isn't what you want, then, well, increase the annual earnings and, you know, thus get the numbers higher. If, on the other hand, something fell through because you're like, well, you're too involved in the business, then in that case, you might want to find ways to, you know, work less and ideally earn more. If the less involved you are, the less critical you are for the agency's day-to-day functioning, the more optional you'll be to the acquirer. And you can be like, great, I want to leave, you know, in 6 months or a year, rather than the acquirer saying, you got to stay here for 3 years and give us a share of the profits, you know, kind of thing. So if a deal falls through, I think it would be worth looking at, and you don't have to share, share your particular details, but, are there things you could do to fix that? Raise the earnings, for instance, make yourself more optional, that kind of thing. You can also still reach out to business brokers to see, do they see the agency as saleable right now? Or are there things they'd recommend you do first? So those are the core directions, given that the goal is to sell or to get acquired. Kate, if you could also share our article on getting acquired, it is worth considering who are potential acquirers. So Mark, as you're weighing, for instance, is it, if you focus on a particular industry, is there some major entity in the industry that wants to scoop up your team? Is there something else where, they would see you as a strategic acquisition target? Or is there, another agency in town that wants to scoop up the clients and or the team, that kind of thing? Right now, given how hard it is to find high quality employees, if you've got a great team and you can figure out a way that the team is likely to want to stay under the new owner, that can be a great way to do, as in investment banking, they talk about the idea of a lift out. You're lifting out the entire team and putting them over to a new company. There are a lot of pros and cons there. That doesn't mean that everyone's going to stick around, this and that. But if you look at the article on Get Acquired, it may give you some ideas of potential acquirers that you hadn't thought of before.
That's awesome. It's, if I may, you had asked, talking about having the employees, I guess, the same vision. If this doesn't go through for whatever reason, is another alternative potentially to offer some of that equity from the current business to the core employees, where we can share that same vision and they can help grow that book of business, maybe to find a better suitor within that top 100 acquirer list.
Yes.
Is that also something to consider? I haven't done that. I'm the sole owner of the company and the agency currently, but obviously there's some great pillars that have certainly are namestays in the agency that do everything, and I'm kind of just the guy atop, trying to run the show.
So it's worth considering. A key question is, do they have enough money to put in to effectively buy out portions of your shares? And does that then create challenges if you're looking for an outside acquirer? Are they going to be like, well, wait a minute, now there are 10 owners, or something like that, versus just one.
Right.
And there are some solutions, things like phantom stock, which is sort of synthetic equity, where maybe they're getting some form of profit sharing, whether your accountant will let you call it that or not, or perhaps they get some percentage of the business at an exit, but if there's no exit, then they don't get it. And that might vest over time. That would require talking to an attorney, for instance, Matchstick Legal on the West Coast or Sharon Turek in Cleveland. The idea there is that, they need to write up the legal paperwork, but the goal is to figure out in general, what are you trying to accomplish? In that case, because the employees would not have a direct voice in the sale because they would not be formal equity owners, that might be a bit cleaner for the acquirer. Of course, you need to decide, will money change hands beforehand? Like, the lawyer can advise on how best to do that. Just keep in mind that you don't want to overcomplicate it. Also, keeping in mind, do employees have money to put in? I have a client who has a key employee where the goal is the employee will eventually buy out the owner. And usually that involves a mix of cash down, SBA loan, in the US at least, and potentially some form of owner financing or seller financing in this case from the previous owner. And one of the key things was I said, have you talked to him about his credit rating? Because, thinking if the employee does not have a good credit score, he's not going to be able to get an SBA loan, because he's going to have to apply for that. And even though it's a few years out, it's like, let's talk now. And so I assigned him in one of our consulting calls to check with the employee. I was like, because if it's below like a 750, he's going to have trouble getting a loan. Answer came back was over 800. Great, all
Right.
set. But don't go out and buy a boat. But assuming that will probably be fine when it comes time for the loan, though
Yeah,
keep
great.
building up cash. So what's your reaction on that?
Yeah, it's all a lot to think of. I think it's very good, and yeah, hopefully this will go through. But if not, there's a lot to consider there for sure. And I think just find the best suitor. Everybody's always anxious to sell and move if the price tag's right. But yeah, never really thought about that if it's a right fit, or hopefully it is. We'll see. But
there's a saying that when you're doing an exit, you can get the price you want or the terms you want, but not both. Maybe for instance, you get a 6x multiple, but they want you to stay for 3 years. Or, maybe you're out in a year, but you're only getting a 4x multiple or something like that. And so you're always having to think about that. One key thing to consider is a model I use in my consulting, which is this. If you're facing a really big decision, consider 2 things. What is your ideal outcome? And what is your minimum acceptable outcome? If you look at those bounds, what's your ideal and what is the absolute minimum? You can find choices that get you somewhere in between. Hopefully better than the minimum acceptable and maybe not as high as the ideal, but that'll help you make things happen. So Mark, thanks so much for joining today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone who has joined Agency Office Hours for November 2021. If you're listening live, you'll get this recording within 24 hours. And if you're listening to the recording, well, you've got it right now. You're welcome to register for any future Agency Office Hours every second Tuesday of every month, 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. That's New York City time. I look forward to seeing you in the next event, and good luck out there. Karl Sakas here, signing off.